my jurisdiction. And I did. 14 to the new terminal on the double. Bye-bye, bad guy. That was just the starter. Now the menu continues.
In August of 1996, Die Hard Trilogy exploded onto the PlayStation in the United States, with Europe and Japan following at Christmas of the same year. Based on the hit movie franchise of the same name, players take on the role of police detective John McClane as they live through the events of the original Die Hard Trilogy movie series. Developed by Probe Entertainment, the game was effectively split into 3 separate arcade-style genres for each movie adaptation. Critical reception at the time was extremely positive for what was a movie-licensed game, and despite the negative reputation of previous Die Hard video games and movie-licensed titles, Die Hard Trilogy caught the attention of both critics and gamers worldwide with its impressive-looking visuals, its incredible soundtrack, and due to the fact that it marketed itself as 3 games in one, which were just as large and impressive as most individual titles released at the time. So grab some shoes that will only fit your sister and come out of that air vent. It's time to look at one of the most explosive video games to be released in the late 90s, Die Hard Trilogy. The game was developed by UK-based studio Probe Entertainment. Originally, the studio only wanted to release one game based on the third film, Die Hard with a Vengeance. A prototype of the driving game was developed and first pitched to Fox Interactive as a standalone title. Fox Interactive were initially very impressed with the prototype, however they would only greenlight the project if Probe agreed to create a game based on the entire Die Hard Trilogy film series. The team agreed, and they chose to develop with the PlayStation as the lead console, as it was agreed that it was the superior platform at the time when compared to the Sega Saturn for its ability and ease to perform 3D processing. When speaking to Next Generation magazine, lead programmer Simon Pick told his team that the Saturn and PC ports would look better if his programming team could emulate the graphical effects of the PlayStation version than to design the game around the limitations of the Sega Saturn. However, despite their intentions to emulate the effects of the PlayStation version, the team ran into several problems with the Saturn's hardware, and they had to get help directly from Sega, and they had to use a special algorithm that Sega had created, which would scan the size of any 3D rendered object, and if the object fell below a specific size, the program just wouldn't texture that object and would place a flat colour in its place. This was designed to help free up the Saturn's processor time and improve the frame rate of the overall game. However, the team also found that they had to reduce the model detail and take some drastic steps to reduce the texture quality and other models directly from every part of the game. How did this impact the final game? Well, we'll go over that a bit later on in the video, but first, let's talk about the games themselves. The adaptation of Die Hard sees the player trapped inside the Nakatomi Plaza as they try to take out terrorists and rescue hostages. The player takes a third-person viewpoint, and the camera is set at around a 45-degree angle behind McClane, so you're not quite behind or above him. The game starts with McClane already in the tower, and Hans Gruber's men are in full control of it. However, it becomes clear to the player instantly that this will not strictly follow the movie. Whilst in the movie, Hans had around 20 or 30 men, in this game he has close to around 800. The first stage you find in the Nakatomi parking garage, and you'll spot links to the movie in the form of the ambulance and the black truck that Hans' men use to infiltrate the building. Though strangely, Argyle's limo isn't anywhere around here. The gameplay sees you running and taking out bad guys with a small variety of weapons, rescuing hostages, and occasionally taking out a boss. It feels very much like a 3D remake of Die Hard on the Nintendo Entertainment System, only vastly superior in every way. The game has an arcade-like quality to it. The player has to take out bad guys as quickly as possible, power-ups litter the stage, and hostages can be rescued.
Get the hell out of here!
All of which adds to your high score. McClane is armed with a handgun with unlimited ammunition, which is surprisingly effective against virtually every single enemy in the game, but you can also find submachine guns, an automatic rifle, and a heavy machine gun.
Ho, ho, ho! I've got a machine gun!
These have limited ammo but are useful for dealing with clusters of enemies. Unfortunately though, the game is a bit repetitive. There are only a handful of stages which recycle with some minor cosmetic changes to them. In terms of gameplay, what you experience in the first stage is more or less what you'll experience for the rest of the game. There is a bonus-like stage where you have to escort hostages to a helicopter on the roof, but these are painfully slow to complete, and eventually you'll just be glad to see the end of them. The game does have some clever little design elements which help mimic the situation that McClane faces in the film. During the movie, McClane has to use the surroundings in order to hide and take out the bad guys by surprise, and in the game you too have to use the geometry of the stages to your advantage. Even in the first level with full health and full armour, if you jump out in the middle of a group of bad guys, even with the most powerful weapon in the game, they will absolutely destroy your health. Whilst the game does have a rudimentary dodge and strafe attack, a really good tactic and use of the level design is to wait around corners and take out enemies on patrol, or to take advantage of explosions, smoke and flashbangs in order to disorientate enemies, quickly allowing you to rescue hostages or take out tricky foes and then vanish into safety. Just going in all Rambo style will quickly get you a game over. Some of the stages have clever bits of design in that you can shoot parts of the construction walls and they'll fall down onto some enemies which will take them out instantly, but this can also harm you and it can also be an instant kill to hostages you've just saved, so you need to be careful. There's also a wonderful bit of game design at play here. With the exception of the first stage and the roof stages, your visibility should be very limited. You are running around an office building with corridors and rooms, and given the position of your camera, you should be very restricted in where you can see. But a few steps to McClane's right and left, if you position him near a wall, the wall becomes transparent, meaning you can see right through it. The benefit of this is that the player never feels cheated should an enemy suddenly ambush you, or if they try to struggle to find a hostage in a locked room, you can see that there's a hostage in there. It almost acts as rudimentary hearing for McClane, kind of like an early warning system, so he doesn't get too much taken advantage of. In what should be a highly restrictive environment, the player is given an option and a chance to see all around them, yet not to the degree which would ruin a surprise. Die Hard 2 takes the form of a first-person, on-rails shooter, which can be played using a lights gun. You can tell that this will be an extremely loose adaptation of the film, right from the first level. Whilst the player sees virtually every setting in the movie, very little is kept true to the film's plot. For example, when McClane first arrives at the airport, in the movie the first battle takes place in the baggage handling area. In the video game, a police car crashes into the airport terminal and someone shoots a rocket launcher at it. As with the first game, there are hundreds of bad guys in this one. This game follows the movie counterpart closer than Die Hard 1 did, in that every level is a clear scene from the movie. You start in the main terminal, then you head to the NX Skywalk, the airport tunnels, and eventually you make your way to the church before finally to the skies as you attempt to shoot down the General's plane. It's almost a remake of the Commodore 64 and MS-DOS version of Die Hard 2, which came out several years earlier. McClane starts with his standard 9mm sidearm and could pick up more weapons along the way, such as machine guns, assault rifles, shotguns, as well as grenades and rockets. A great feature about the game is that you can actually play it using a light gun as well as a standard controller. Sadly, the game is quite short. Once you master it, it'll take just under an hour to complete, but despite its short length, it's probably the most fun of the 3 titles. The third game is a drastic shift in tone and gameplay compared to the other titles. Whilst the other games involve you shooting bad guys, this sees you take the wheel of an assortment of vehicles, trying to defuse bombs in a controlled explosion around a fictionalized New York City. How do you do this? Do you carefully disarm the bomb, place C4 around it and detonate it from a safe distance? No! You crash a taxi into it! This is pretty much the whole game, but it's utterly insane. You can have NPC police cars randomly crashing into other vehicles, you can use ambulance power-ups to smash through traffic jams, you can trigger a turbo boost for an insane speed gain. The game doesn't follow the plot of the movie much at all. Whilst you drive around many of the areas from the film, such as Harlem, Chinatown, Central Park, and even through the New York subway system and aqueducts, you'll play these stages completely out of order, and even return to previous locations with a slightly different layout. It's very similar to the first game in how they reuse levels but slightly change them to make it appear like it's a new experience. It's also quite twisted in an over-the-top cartoon violence kind of way, for two reasons: gore and fire. The game is very, very gory, and you might think, doesn't seem gory, what's wrong with it? But if you switch camera angles to the first person view, where you can actually see what happens when you run down civilians, oh boy. Basically, the civilians explode and cover your screen with chunks. The PC and Saturn version, however, do tone the gore down. And this brings us to the twisted humour of this particular game. McClane turns on the window screen wipers and the gore is gradually brushed off until the window screen is clear. In fact, when the game was due for release in Germany, the censor refused to allow it to be sold unless the gore effect was completely removed from that version of the game. Then there is the matter of what happens when you defuse a bomb in this game. If any civilian is caught in the controlled blast, they will effectively become the Human Torch. But the strangest part is if any pigeons are caught in the blast, they'll fly away as if everything is perfectly fine, except for the fact that they're completely on fire. During each stage, you can find new vehicles to travel in, and some have benefits like sirens to them, which make civilians automatically move out of your way. Others are faster, and some are much slower, but act like battering rams to crash through traffic in order to get to somewhere quicker. Sadly, like with Die Hard 1, the game does become very repetitive later on, but the final boss more than makes up for it. It's absolutely crazy. Simon Gruber takes to a helicopter and you have to take him down. And when you get to this stage, you think, oh, am I going to be using guns at last? But no, instead of using weapons, you drive around the docks and hit these power-ups called launchers, which catapult your car into the sky, and you have to crash your car into Gruber's helicopter. Yeah, it's exactly like that scene in the fourth Die Hard movie. You kill the helicopter with a car. The game doesn't have anything close to realistic driving physics, so don't go into this expecting anything other than crazy arcade-style driving. There's even a button which makes you perform a near-perfect 90-degree turn. I do like this choice to make the driving completely unrealistic, because as you're going around New York performing these impossible maneuvers, it helps emulate the fast camera cuts from the movie that it's based on, and this makes the action appear more fast and frantic. Whilst no official making-of material was released at the time, over 10 years after the game's release, in 2009, a homemade documentary was uploaded to YouTube by Die Hard Trilogy's lead artist, Dennis Gufferson, which shows an incredible behind-the-scenes view of the game and its development. Early in the game's development, the team actually used assets and build materials from their previous game, Alien Trilogy, as temporary placeholders. One build of the game was a Frankenstein-like build, which used a large portion of Alien Trilogy's code as a foundation for Die Hard. In this video, you can see that when the game starts, the title screen for Alien Trilogy pops up, and McClane is actually running around the Nakatomi parking lot shooting the terrorists with a Colonial Marines pulse rifle.
Great sound effects as well.
Is that Alien sound effects too? Machine guns.
A very early build for the game shows Die Hard 3 in its pitch state to Fox, and it appears to show that each stage only had one bomb that the player needed to find and destroy. The player would have to drive to phone boxes in order to get more time and pick up clues to the bomb's location before it detonated and destroyed the city.
Nice. Here's a phone booth. You get to a phone booth, which is shaking, means it's ringing, ring, ring.
park by it, you get more time and then you move on.
The game also used some basic motion capture, and it was done on an extremely low budget. Unlike modern developers, which often use professional motion capture studios, Probe Entertainment actually rented a school sports hall and attached the capture nodes using sticky tape to the actors' bodies. The full making of documentary is on YouTube, and it's certainly worth a watch if you have any interest in game development. As mentioned briefly before, the game was originally developed for the Sony PlayStation, but was also ported over to the Saturn and PC in early 1997. All three versions are the same game, but the PlayStation was the lead format, and is clearly the superior version across all three platforms. Each game in the collection has a noticeable drop in quality in some way compared to the PlayStation versions, but when you compare the third game, you can really see the difference. The Saturn version is missing a lot of detail compared to the PlayStation. It also has different music cues and is missing a lot of particle effects, such as dust from the helicopter rotor blades, and lots of flame effects from the explosions. There are also some missing sound effects, like the rumble from the helicopter at the start of the game. The draw distance on the Saturn is also the poorest of all three versions. You can see this right from the first level. On the PlayStation and PC versions, you can see the bridge in the distance, but on the Saturn, you have to travel a significant distance before it comes into view. The number of birds, civilians, and even traffic is also greatly reduced. Note the lack of cars. In terms of pure technical performance, the Saturn version might be the worst of all three. But when you look what they did to the PC version, it's really hard to recommend that version at all. Whilst the PC version has improved draw distance compared to the Saturn, and much brighter and clearer visuals than even some parts of the PlayStation version, the PC version has multiple issues across all three games. In Die Hard 1, explosions look bad, and a lot of the icons in the UI are also really poorly done. And when the end level bomb triggers, on the PlayStation version, it's a dramatic countdown which gets larger and larger as time ticks away. It really brings up the tension to the player to try and find the bomb before it detonates. On the PC version, the countdown effect is a static font which doesn't change in size the closer it gets to detonation. It really doesn't help raise the tension, it just looks terrible. Die Hard 2 also has problems. Explosions and visual effects are changed to sprites over 3D graphical effects. The best way to illustrate this is to compare the final level on the PlayStation version. The plane has lingering fire damage and explosive effects, but on the PC, it lacks any lingering effects and just looks terrible in comparison. But it's Die Hard 3 where everything just looks terrible. This is what happens when the player detonates the first bomb on the PlayStation version. Here is what it looks like on the Saturn, and now the PC.
Go, go, go!
And then you have other oddities like this. When you complete a stage and the game calculates your score, on the PlayStation version you get this nice visual sequence, and on the Saturn version this sequence is completely removed. Instead, it's a simple text screen that quickly calculates your score. And the PC version also uses the Saturn scoring screen, only it looks like this. Just look at it. It just looks so bad. It looks like there was no effort put into this whatsoever. Even the title screens just use a basic red font to tell the player which game it is they're currently playing. So without question, if I had to recommend a version of the game for you to play, it would be the PlayStation version, hands down.
NYPD!
I'm going to now talk about the voice acting in this game. None of the original cast from the movies provide any voice work at all for this game. The actual voices they did get are, well, I kind of like them.
Get the hell out of here!
McClane's voice actor actually gives a great performance in Die Hard 1 and 3. In Die Hard 1, it really does sound like an average cop that's just way over his head. He cracks one-liners, he yells instructions at hostages. Really does sound like he could be an alternative John McClane in this series.
Ho ho ho! I've got a machine gun!
Die Hard 3, he really does sound like a man who just doesn't know why Simon wants him, and who also has a really bad migraine throughout it.
Someone give me some aspirin.
But in Die Hard 2, This is where the voice actor tries to impersonate the real-life Bruce Willis. On a number of occasions, his delivery sounds like that of an impersonation and not of a performance.
This is not my day. I'm right here. Stay in your seats until the plane reaches the terminal.
It's not terrible, but it's definitely the weakest of the three games. The person who plays Zeus also does a great job. He's not trying to impersonate Samuel L. Jackson, despite all his lines pretty much being lifted from the movie. But he does sound like an average man who's been dragged into this mess against his will for just trying to stop his neighbourhood from going to hell. And with some of his delivery, you can tell he thinks that McClane is a complete madman.
Back home, motorhead! Bad idea! Why me? What has this got to do with me?
The NPC voices are hilariously bad. The screams of pain are comically over the top, but in Die Hard 1, the enemies actually drop one-liners of their own, and they're amazing. We have British and American voice actors trying to speak Germanized English with glorious lines such as,
Don't let him get away! Die, cowboy! He's a sitting duck. I see him!
It's gloriously awful, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Critical reception for the game was extremely high, with most outlets giving the game a mid to high 9 out of 10. IGN gave it a 7.5, praising the game's attention to detail, and Paul Glancy of the Sega Saturn magazine praised the game for having 3 equally strong titles, which had no clear title which was the one the developers favoured. The game was even nominated for Best Adaptation of Linear Media at the 1996 Game Developers Contest, but lost out to I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. But it did win EGM's Action Game of the Year award. There was one common complaint though, which was quite a big issue. The full value of Die Hard 2 required players to own a compatible light gun. On the Saturn, this wasn't much of an issue because the standard Sega Saturn light gun was fully compatible with the game. However, on the PlayStation, the number one selling light gun at the time was the G-Con 45, but this gun was completely incompatible with Die Hard 2. Details regarding the soundtrack are very limited, which is a shame, because it's absolutely brilliant. Neil Palmer worked with industry veteran Stephen Root to create an entirely original soundtrack which uses no music from the movies. The soundtrack is mainly composed of techno rock tracks which completely fit in with the tone and the frantic nature of the first game. The pumping beats make it sound almost like a heartbeat that gets faster and faster as the action gets more and more intense. The soundtrack does include some non-techno tracks, which are used to incredible effect in Die Hard 3. Each track fits the theme of each stage incredibly well. The Harlem track is one of my favourites in the entire game. It uses sampled sound effects and it sets the tone of the frantic nature and the insane mission that McClane and Zeus are going to be going through during this game. It's never been released in any form other than the PlayStation and the Saturn disc, which is a huge shame because it's such an incredible listen and you'll definitely be humming the music long after you finish the game. So usually with movie licensed video games, you normally have to wait for a new movie to come out in order to get a sequel to the video game itself. But Die Hard Trilogy actually got a sequel. Die Hard Trilogy 2 Viva Las Vegas was released on the PlayStation and PC in early 2000. It's a completely original story starring John McClane in Las Vegas. The game was developed by N-Space and it incorporates the original's 3 gameplay styles into a single experience. Despite the popularity of the first game, when it appeared in magazines at the time, myself and all my friends thought it looked awful, and when it was eventually released, it scored very badly compared to the original. Graphics were noticeably poorer, and critics absolutely hated the driving segments, claiming in some cases that they were near unplayable. Looking back on the original game now, I can remember when I got it for Christmas in 1996, and I was addicted to it. On Christmas Day, I found myself jumping back and forth between Die Hard 1 and 2 for nearly the entire day. The game had such an impact on me at the time. When I went to sleep that night, I had trouble getting to sleep because the music and the visuals were just constantly running through my head, and it was keeping me awake so much that I eventually got back up and played it long into the night. Die Hard Trilogy was a game that kept me entertained for days, but I do remember becoming a bit bored at Die Hard 1, and by the time I reached the end of Die Hard 3, I was just ready for it to be over, mainly due to the repetitive nature of those two games. But I still highly recommended the game to my friends at school at the time. Today, I would still recommend it, but I fully agree it's a very hard sell. It's aged rough, but not badly. However, some of the design choices look a bit silly now, especially the NPCs and enemy when they get up close. It looks like both their arms and legs are dislocated as they run, presenting some incredibly comical and freakishly nightmare-like moments. Look at this! This game feels in so many ways like it was destined to be an arcade title that received an extremely well done home port. It's not a masterpiece, it's not a hidden revolutionary experience, but they essentially created 3 solid gameplay experiences and took the essence of the movies instead of trying to recreate them completely. If you ever wanted a case study for how to do a movie license game right, Die Hard Trilogy is a prime candidate. Checking eBay at the moment, the PlayStation version is really cheap and you can pick up the best version of the game for under the price of a coffee. So if you're into retro gaming and you fancy having bad guys scream, "Die, cowboy!" in a bad German accent, this is definitely a game to add to your collection. See you next time. Hey guys, thanks for checking out my video. If you found this video interesting and enjoyed it, please click that like and subscribe button. And if you know anybody else who might be interested, please share it with your fellow friends and minions. If you want to continue the adventures, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And if you'd like to support the work I do further, please consider backing me on Patreon. Or if you'd just like to make a one-off donation, why not treat me to a coffee? Links to both are in the video description. Even the smallest donation is a huge help to keeping this channel going. But most of all, just thank you for taking the time out to watch this video and enjoy the work I do. It really does mean the world to me. Thank you.